Let's just start. I think I'm ready whenever you are. We can just go back and forth. It's so great to see people here today.
Yeah, great. Well, maybe, yeah, Laura, do you want to introduce yourself and then I'll go and then we can get into the questions?
Sure. My name is Dr. Laura Anderson. I live in the United States from Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a licensed psychotherapist in the state of Tennessee and also a trauma resolution and recovery coach. I have a practice called the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, and we primarily focus on complex trauma with a focus in religious trauma, people coming out of cults, adverse religious experiences, high control religion, which sounds like a funny, weird thing. Like, why am I here today? But my own personal experience is one of pretty early perimenopause. And so that's been something that I had been diving research wise into for quite some time. And a lot of my clients who are dealing with complex trauma are also in varying stages of perimenopause, and we're looking a lot at how trauma and perimenopause/menopause interact with one another. I'm also a podcast co-host of a couple different podcasts, one of which is called The Wise Jezebels, where we talk about anything and everything. And so perimenopause is something that comes up all the time because that's our audience. And so this is definitely an area that I talk about a lot, kind of informally and in conversation, but it's fun to be able to start talking about this more professionally, since I do it one-on-one, but in a larger setting is really fun. And the research around trauma and perimenopause is so needed and very rich. And once you start to understand it, I think offers so much relief, even just to, understand what's going on. So it's wonderful to be here with everybody today.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. That's fascinating. I was just in Nashville.
Oh, you were?
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sad we didn't know each other
I
yet then.
know. Next time.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Sulla Windgassen. I'm a health psychologist and cognitive behavioral therapist, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapist. So my specialism is in using evidence-based psychotherapy to help people navigate physical health issues, to either physically improve them or to have them so that they're not so negatively impacting on their mood and everyday function. So I work with a lot of different health conditions, but my specialism tends to be in women's health. And so menopause comes up a lot. And in my work, just broadly speaking, understanding the mind-body connection and the legitimate science behind the mind-body connection, as opposed to a lot of the pseudoscience behind it, it really makes a lot of sense that when women come into perimenopause and menopause, they are impacted a lot by psychological changes and difficulties and trauma. The interaction between trauma and menopause is really, really fascinating. And I think the research is in its infancy, but what is there, again, makes sense of a lot of other research we have in different areas. So I'm excited to explore that together.
This is great.
Yeah.
I'm excited to learn from you too.
Yes.
Yes. It's wonderful. All right. Well, I'm ready to get into the questions whenever you are.
Great. So I think we've got these questions already sent from the peri community, which was the first one: how does perimenopause trigger PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Sorry, there's a bit of I don't know if you can hear the feedback.
Yeah, if everybody else wants to maybe mute their microphones, that would be great.
Okay. So yeah, this is an interesting one because I guess we have to start with the terminology, right? So when we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, that is distinct from the broad definition of trauma, which in itself often gets kind of confused a little bit. There's trauma in the context of PTSD. So by that definition, it's where you've experienced threatened or actual violence or sexual violence or harm, or you've witnessed or thought that you might die. So really kind of life-threatening or safety-threatening distress. And that's a real specific area, right, of trauma. And in the DSM and in the ICD-10, which is like the diagnostic manuals that we use in the UK for helping create these classifications of what PTSD is, there needs to have been some presence of trauma that falls under that kind of definition, right? So either actual harm or perceived likelihood that there's going to be some kind of harm, or a witnessing of harm to others. And where this gets confused sometimes is that now there are much broader definitions of trauma which take into account adversity, where there can be high levels of distress, but they're not necessarily related to those kind of safety concerns. So this could be relational trauma, like neglect, or breakdown of relationships, or where your worth is threatened, or your sense of who you are is threatened. And these have big effects on how we feel and how our life pans out, and how we kind of cope with things. But it's kind of separate to traumas defined in the PTSD definition. So what's really interesting, I was really interested by this question in itself, and it made me wonder, the sequence of the question. So how does the experience of perimenopause trigger PTSD? So to have PTSD start, there needs to have been some kind of trauma. And then PTSD in itself is the experience of re-experiencing that trauma. So that might be flashbacks, where you're going back to the memory of the trauma, or memories of the trauma, or it might be where you're getting nightmares, or you get in the kind of somatic sense, it physically feels like you're back there. You might not have it play out visually. And along with that, some kind of re-experiencing, there also needs to be a hypervigilance, so that your body is on guard to kind of protect yourself from the likelihood that this thing's going to happen again. And that hypervigilance can be in the form of like, can't relax and feel like, think things might spiral if you're not on top of everything. But it can also be in terms of like irritability, and that sense of not having any capacity. And then so we've got the experience of some kind of trauma at some point. We've got the experience of re-experiencing that, your brain circling back and your nervous system circling back to that. And then we've got the hypervigilance, which can be felt in lots of different ways, and then avoidance. And there needs to be some kind of avoidance, things that we're no longer doing to try and prevent ourselves from getting the symptoms of PTSD, or being back in the situation where we might get more of that trauma. So it's a pretty kind of rigorous diagnostic. And I was, like I said, I was really interested in the sequence of the question, if perimenopause can trigger PTSD. And there's some really interesting research that shows that there might be trauma that's happened way prior that only starts coming back to us around perimenopause, to the degree that then you start getting those really strong symptoms of PTSD. And we're still in the infancy of understanding, but this does seem to be something that's happening for enough women for there to have been a research paper. And that's quite startling in itself, because women's health isn't usually researched that readily. So it's a common thing that's happening for lots of people. And I guess to understand how that might happen, just understanding some of the physiology behind what's going on in menopause, so you and perimenopause. So we know that essentially there's this change in the disposition of these hormones, two central hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And generally estrogen and progesterone have these far-reaching effects on lots of things that are happening biologically, but also psychologically in our body. They help to keep our mood stabilized. They help to keep our temperature regulated. They help us sleep, like so many different functions. And they interact with an area of the brain and are impacted by an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for the processing of memories, long-term memories. And so there's kind of a hypothesis starting that when we get drops or fluctuations in these hormones, it's having an interaction with the hippocampus and related areas of the brain, and the rest of the autonomic nervous system, which means that we're then presented with memories that might have been left way back, and we might have kind of perfected these skills of disattending to stuff that happened previously. But through these biological fluctuations, this area of the brain now kind of starts producing these memories, which can be really distressing to then experience again. And that in itself can then kick off this kind of vicious cycle of feeling anxious about it, feeling worried about it, feeling emotionally affected by it, you know, in lots of specific ways related to that specific experience. And then that can then kick off these sorts of symptoms of PTSD. Why am I thinking about that? I need to avoid that. I need to do this. I need to do that. And we get all of the symptoms that I was mentioning with the diagnostic of PTSD, where we have to try and redouble our efforts to push things down. So
treatment, the do-it-yourself solution.
Sorry. So there's this interaction between biology and psychology that then starts kind of mixing up again to kick off symptoms.
Yeah, I think that was really good. And the thing I was thinking of as you were answering this kind of actually goes into the second question as well. But when we're talking about like the protective factors like of estrogen and the things that we can do when we're at our what might be considered quote unquote normal levels of estrogen, allow us capacity to deal with things in different ways. We just have greater bandwidth to deal with stress, to deal with anxiety, to deal with the stuff of life. And so when we think about how our hormones are fluctuating and just the natural decrease in just estrogen, not even any of the other hormones, chemicals, brain chemistry, things that are going on during perimenopause, we notice that just our capacity to make accommodations for ourselves, masking, coping, decreases, which means it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the sudden, you know, it's like, oh, we had, you know, memories can resurface, and we're not making those up. It's just that we had different ways of being able to deal with things. We had different coping mechanisms. We had different resources available to us. The other thing that came to mind with this question is there's many symptoms of PTSD that are mirrored by symptoms of perimenopause. You think about things like anxiety, you think about things like depression, the vasomotor responses like within the nervous system. You think about a hot flash and how your nervous system is, you know, kind of overacting in that can mirror fight or flight symptoms, which our nervous systems operate off of familiarity and not off of conscious thought, right? So our bodies will go, oh, this feels familiar to this last time that I was in perhaps this dangerous situation, which can also then trigger back to times where we were in real or perceived dangerous situations. And when we have that lower threshold or capacity to be able to navigate situations or access to coping mechanisms, we might see then that some of these PTSD triggers or situations that have laid dormant maybe for years or decades, or that we thought we had resolved, are now all of a sudden resurfacing. And that's not a result of you doing anything wrong, or maybe even needing to go back to therapy. It's just going, hey, there's stuff that is happening in your brain and body, and we can get some different support around you to help you navigate these in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really nicely speaks to that second question that we had there from the community.
Yes.
Does trauma become more prevalent in the perimenopause stage of life? Meaning, does it bother you more in this stage of life? So I think that beautifully kind of summed that up, the impact of that decreased capacity because of estrogen. And just like you say, that the triggering effect of that physical response to the menopause.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of research coming out now, and I know that what we're not talking about neurodivergence and ADHD, but we're seeing a lot of women who are being diagnosed later in life with any variety of disorders on the neurodivergent spectrum. And it may not be that all of a sudden they just developed that. We see a lot of research coming out now about how estrogen's impact is on the brain and the overlap there. And it's not that they just woke up one day and all of a sudden these women have ADHD, but it's that they may have had it for quite some time. They just had extra skills and coping mechanisms to be able to manage and mask what was already there all along. And so we see that then not just with ADHD, but I think also with trauma. I know I've seen that in my own practice with my clients who will go, gosh, I feel like I had this managed for decades. And then all of a sudden the can of worms was opened, and it's like my life was forever changed. And it can be very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that point also feeds nicely into the next question, which was, does past trauma make marital relationships more difficult in perimenopause and menopause? And that conceptualization of there will have been lots of stuff that we've just had served to us, biological stuff from genetic predispositions and illnesses and all sorts of stuff that's happened and changed our body and influenced our physiology to begin with, before we were born and after. Psychological stuff, our personalities, how we see the world, our relationships, which feeds into, our social setting, and how that then influences, the interaction between all of those different things going forwards. And just like you were saying, Laura, we develop coping strategies and ways of just navigating life, some of which are just ways that we go about doing things and habits, and some of them are coping strategies to things that are perhaps more difficult, or things that impede us in some way, whether that's health issues, or whether that's financial situations or relationship situations. And those coping strategies can serve us really well and keep things just balanced. And sometimes we might feel like our head dips underwater, but we get back up and we start we redouble our efforts, and that all works fine. And usually this is when I end up seeing people in my practice, because I see them at the point where those coping strategies aren't working anymore because of such situations outside of their control, whether that's because health has changed, or whether that's because social support systems have changed, or there's been big life transitions. What was once working no longer works. And when that happens, it's like a rug being pulled, and your sense of reality can really get distorted, or it's the other way around, really. You can feel like your sense of reality was distorted before, because now how you thought things were, it's just not working like that anymore. And at this point, lots of people are like, I just don't know what's wrong with me, and it all gets self-directed. Why can't I cope with this? What's happening? Why am I deficient? I should just be able to X, Y, and Z. And from an observer's perspective, as a therapist, you can see, well, actually a lot's changed, and it's going to take quite a few steps to try and help you get your head around this, because you've always coped in this way. And that's a tall order to suddenly now have to deal with these extra restraints, or try and go back to old coping when your capacity is depleted. And so if we bring that back to the question about, does past trauma make marital relationships more difficult in perimenopause and menopause, maybe we've been having an okay relationship because we've been able to ignore things that don't irritate us quite so much, or we've been able to take on extra emotional load and cognitive load. And then estrogen depletes and our capacity depletes, and suddenly we're like, wow, why are you picking up your slack? and it's not like it's a new thing, but our experience of it is very different, because we just don't have that automatic buffer that was there. And so it makes absolute sense that can then yes, stir up relational difficulties.
Yeah. I think trauma in any relationship can be difficult, even if we're not in the life phase of perimenopause or menopause. And if you're actively navigating it, well, even if you're not actively navigating trauma, the resolution of it, it can impact your relationships. Certainly, if you're trying to just suppress it, that can be very detrimental to a relationship. But yes, then when you're adding on the physiological impacts of perimenopause and menopause, that can't not impact your relationship. And the combination of the two is going to have an impact. And when you don't have a partner who is understanding what's going on, they can also then take deep offense to that. They can be very much on the defense, wonder what is happening. There's maybe a lack of empathy and compassion. it can feel very isolating for both parties, feeling like my partner has changed somehow. I'm no longer with this person that I used to be. And it's kind of there's many women in their 40s and 50s who are going, I'm done. I'm out. I just want a new partner. Sometimes it's because of this, lack of estrogen, because we're like, I am not like picking up the slack anymore. I'm done being the mother to my partner. I don't need to do this. And that can be very confusing for the other partner who's gone, I thought we had a relatively okay relationship up till this point. And so I've seen, different combinations of how trauma can impact that or not. And, you know, yeah, everybody's going to be a little bit different in terms of how their trauma may or may not impact perimenopause. And then if they're in a relationship, and how the partner can support them plays a big role in how that transition is navigated. But I do think that if partners can be supportive during that transition, it can be navigated well, and relationships don't have to end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I often explain this as like a stacking sequence. So let's take past trauma as something that got added on, and the specifics of that is going to have an impact on your psychology and your coping and how you see yourself and other people. So let's say there's like a past trauma of neglect, not being looked after, and so we might have this inbuilt belief of like, it's all on me, or I'm insignificant, or not good enough to be cared about, something along those lines. And we develop lots of ways of coping with that so that we don't have to feel that. And maybe that's by being like really, really independent, or maybe that's by caring lots for other people so that we get it reciprocated, or we get the reinforcement of that happening. And then comes perimenopause, our estrogen drops, we have less capacity for feeling that way in the first place, but also dealing in those coping strategies. And then if we think about what Laura was saying there, the partner's response, if the partner isn't so understanding when you're depleted, it's almost like being re-traumatized, because there you are again in a situation of, oh, I'm depleted or vulnerable, and this person's not caring for me when I need it most, and I can't like make sense of my needs, and this person, after years and years and years of me supporting them and putting my all in, is not able to meet me where I am. And yes, I don't know what my own needs are necessarily, but it would be nice to feel like they're able to step in. So I think, yeah, it can be a really tricky time, because we've been doing so much for so long, and then it can resemble past experiences.
Yeah. And I think so many women too are used to just doing that. They're used to taking the emotional labor. They're used to, taking care of a lot of people, forgetting their own needs, whether there's trauma or not. And so when that estrogen has decreased and there's just lowered capacity to take on the needs of everybody else, there is a clarity that happens, an emotional and relational clarity that happens, that definitely impacts not only marital relationships, but I think all relationships. And then when we add, trauma on top of it, and I will say this too, I have many clients that I work with who do have a trauma history, who have done great work in their trauma and feel very resolved, and then are going through perimenopause and have that sense of clarity. And as a result, go, hey, I still see these patterns that are coming out, like some relational patterns as a result of my trauma. And even though I'm not currently activated or anything like that, I now have the wherewithal to say, no more. I'm done with these relational patterns, and I'm implementing boundaries, or I'm making my circle of influence smaller. So it's not all bad. It actually can be quite healthy, because you start to find what is most important to you, and you go, this is where I'll spend, or who I will spend my time and energy with. And it can be actually pretty fulfilling. So it's not all bad, but it can be difficult to weather at times. So I don't want to not, I don't want to say it's all, roses, but sometimes there is a silver lining.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's important to recognize, I like that word clarity, the clarity that it can also bring once we realize like, okay, these are the different components coming on, but maybe this is an invitation for me to, reassess some of the things that I've been asking for myself, perhaps unreasonably so, for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe this brings us
Right.
nicely to the next question, which was,
Yes.
is it possible for the intensity of feelings around trauma to continue past perimenopause?
I mean, the short answer to this, I would say, is yes. The more complex answer is anytime that we have unresolved trauma, we're going to look at that intensity of feelings either being the same or increasing over time. Unfortunately, trauma unresolved doesn't usually go away. There's that cliche statement of time heals all wounds, which may be true in some cases, but when we're talking about trauma, that's usually not the case. Now, when we talk about perimenopause coming to an end with menopause and then being postmenopausal, we do know, and research talks about this, we might come to a more stable place with our mood. We might feel like we have some of those coping skills back, where we might feel like our quote unquote old self, whatever that might mean. We might have more capacity in our brains and bodies to do things that feel more familiar to us. So certainly that is potentially available to us. But when we talk about trauma as itself, the feelings and intensity around that might not necessarily go away simply because perimenopause is over. And so we might have access to more coping skills on an easier, like within our reach. But I would say that it's entirely possible for the intensity of feelings around trauma to be just as present post menopause. And that's simply because they are two separate entities that just sometimes cross over, depending on the work that you're doing in your own body, maybe with or without a therapist. And yeah, the trauma will need to be worked on whatever stage of life you're at. That's my professional opinion, but it will continue until it's resolved.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think sometimes it feels unfair because if you have had everything, feeling on an even keel, and then perimenopause comes up, and then it feels like, oh, actually, why are things suddenly so difficult now? And why is this all stirred up when I had it all good? Yeah, it feels unfair, and like, well, if it wasn't there before and this has just happened, surely when this subsides, it will go away again. And that's the most natural kind of intuitive conclusion. But I agree with you, Laura. We could maybe see it more as an invite of like, or maybe there's just some more processing to be done of the trauma, or just some compassionate work with, how you're feeling, rather than just bracing until you get through it, which can end up with us relying on tools that aren't the best for us in coping some of the intrusive symptoms.
Yeah. I was listening to a podcast this morning with Dr. Mary Claire Haver, who is, very known in menopause care world. And, she was talking about when she was being trained as a gynecologist, and how this period of time for women used to be viewed as kind of just like, well, you've reached your end, right? And like, you're just going to have to suffer through the rest of your life. And doctors kind of had this term for women called the WW, the whiny woman. And you just kind of had to suffer. That was just it, and her whole mantra, and the mantra of the menopause is, this is going to happen, right? We're going to be going through this, but suffering is optional. And this idea that we're entering into this really prime stage of our lives. Many people are, you know, at the top of their careers. Their children are older or maybe out of the home. Maybe financially, they're in better places than they were in their 20s or 30s. Hopefully, they'll have more energy, and they're, you know, if they've done their if they've been able to do their due diligence with perimenopause, maybe they've got some tools under their tool belt. So they've, you know, nutritionally and movement wise and hormone replacement, we've got some of these things going for us. And I think about that with the trauma piece too. When it's not easy work. Trauma work is not easy work. And it takes a brave person to navigate that. But when we give ourselves the permission to go into that space, that also, there's freedom on the other side of that. I really believe that like our life is for living. And when we talk about this kind of transitory phase in our life, you know, there's a point where perimenopause comes to an end, you know, and we're postmenopausal, and there's hopefully that freedom, right? We've got the back half of our life to live. And when we are resolving our trauma, like that is part of the freedom, you know, and there's so much hope, and there's so much healing, and there's so much resiliency. And that's my invitation for anybody who is navigating trauma, is that it doesn't have to be this all the time. Like there is life on the other side of it. There's life all the way through it. And so, yeah, that's just something that I would invite people to consider, because there is freedom in that process of healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think having that sense of this isn't the end, you know, yes, the invite for hope, and that there's a lot, you know, to be worked with and enjoyed still is so important to have that. Okay, the next question that we've got here is what the heck is happening that has caused all old trauma to dramatically resurface alongside heightened anxiety and now OCD? What is happening in my brain to cause this, and where is the research, please? Yeah.
Oh, well, I feel like this is maybe a little bit of kind of some of the things that we've been talking about before. My hunch, obviously, I do not know the background of the person who's asking this question, so I'm going to take a couple assumptions here. And if there's trauma that maybe hasn't been resolved, perhaps it's that we've had other coping mechanisms and ways of navigating it that have worked, right? Or have been okay. They've helped us manage through many years of our life. And now we're at a place where that's just not as effective as it was before. And it means that we, like we talked about with the way that, say, estrogen is depleting, and our hormones are all over the place, and our body chemistry is changing. It impacts the way that we are able to navigate in every single facet of life. And that means that the things that used to work no longer work. And so it's entirely possible that, you know, the things that we thought like, hey, that's another chapter of my life. It's just, it's in the past, and it stayed in the past. And now our bodies are going, nope, we never dealt with that. And now it's time to deal with it. The coping mechanisms that we used to have don't work so great. And the OCD, the anxiety piece, like, I mean, those can be symptoms of trauma, like coping mechanisms, symptoms of trauma. They also go hand in hand with perimenopause. So I don't know which is chicken or the egg. That piece, I'm not sure, that would be different for every single person, but we might be looking at that as part of the symptoms of perimenopause as well. So where is the research? If you're interested, Google Scholar is a great space, and you could just look up perimenopause and anxiety, perimenopause and OCD, trauma and anxiety, trauma and OCD, trauma and perimenopause. Like there is a ton of research. But yeah, I mean, heightened anxiety with trauma Absolutely. OCD, there's a couple different schools of thought with OCD and trauma. Trauma as a coping mechanism or trauma as a symptom. That's a whole conversation and soapbox unto itself. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say, Sula.
So I mean, I agree with all of that. And I guess from the more biological, if you like, and just understanding that all the things we're talking about is just a blend and an interaction of biological processes, psychological and social processes. All of our experiences, consist of all of those things, really, because our body is basically the hardware that's processing the software, which is the psychological and social experiences. So from a biological point of view, I guess I'll come back to what I mentioned at the beginning around one of the kind of key areas in the brain that is responsible for processing long-term memories is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus has lots of different duties, emotional processing being one of them, confining long-term memories from just experiences into long-term memory, and then being able to retrieve long-term memories. And it kind of blends the emotional experience with the time reference, with the context of the memory. And so what we know about trauma is it changes the structure of the hippocampus, or it can do anyway. So we can have like a shrunken structure of the hippocampus when we experience trauma, which can then obviously change how it processes stuff and what its abilities are. We also know, so that's kind of part of the physiology of trauma in the hippocampus. There's lots more to it, but just for time constraints, that gives you an idea of how much trauma can change this part of the brain region, which is important for how we process memories and start to view things off the back of our experiences. Then if we think about what's happening in perimenopause and menopause, we have this reduction in estrogen, and estrogen has a really important role in hippocampal function. So we kind of need a good old balance of estrogen to make sure that the hippocampus is functioning as it needs to be functioning. And hippocampus, it's responsible for old memories, and it's also responsible for learning new memories. And so if we have fluctuating and lowering levels of estrogen, and that impacts on the hippocampus, which also kind of is this gateway between how our brains process trauma and old memories, and also process emotions, it kind of stands to reason that we might experience quirks of that in terms of more traumatic experiences coming back into our conscious awareness, because the timestamp that was on the memories isn't in hard enough, as it were. So it comes up as like, oh, remember this. And it's less to do with our intentional retrieval and more to do with like just a quirk of like paper being flung up in the air rather than being back in the filing cabinet. So we can think about, on a physiological level, estrogen changing in perimenopause, changing hippocampal function, changing then our experience of past traumas, coming up as more present day things as opposed to past things that we've processed. And that will come with anxiety and other emotion, or maybe anxiety or other emotional responses, depending on what the nature of the memories are and what have you. But at the same time, estrogen's also doing a number on other areas of the brain and levels of neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, which are mood regulators and have an impact on how we're able to process and manage stress. So we're kind of getting it from multiple angles by virtue of this one hormone kind of changing things. And then we're having our psychological experience of that, which then starts to feed into that vicious cycle that I was talking about at the beginning. So if we then are really scared by this experience of getting these memories, or we're then really frustrated or saddened or whatever, maybe a concoction of all, of having these memories come back and, feeling disturbed by it, or feeling, like things are falling apart, that's then going to impact on what we do. Oh God, I can't possibly see anybody, because what if I just, everything goes out of control, and then we're more isolated, and then that has an impact on our mood, or we're more guarded about what we talk about, or there's so many different ways that we then respond, or we try our hardest not to think about something which on a neuroscience level, is a surefire way of us actually ending up thinking about it and causing a lot of like extra strain on our amygdala as we try and suppress stuff down. So again, this cocktail of biology and psychology together, and I guess the maybe the natural question is, well, what do we do if we're served up this biological cocktail? How do we then work with that? And to echo what Laura was saying before, maybe it's an invitation to do some processing to just help that kind of actually be filed away for good. Or, you know, if some people are really averse to doing trauma processing, and really understandably, because it's not easy going, but maybe it's licensed to go and seek some support for just being gentle with yourself as you're going through this, so that you don't have to default to these really vigilant responses, internal and external, that can then keep these spirals going.
Yeah.
Hopefully that answers your question as well there, Mary, in the comments.
Yeah. And I think too, just to add to that, you know, and you've kind of hit on this, like self-compassion goes a long way. I know it doesn't sound like it fixes everything, but it actually really can. Like there's many people who do so much work prior to going through perimenopause, and then all these things happen, our bodies, our brains, our relationships, everything changes, and we go, oh my gosh, you know, I spent the first 10 years of my adulthood going to therapy, and now it's like, did any of it work? And the fact of the matter is, yes, it did. But we're going through this transitory period, and things are just different. And so giving yourself some self-compassion to say, like, this is a period of time. It's like a second adolescence in a way, right? So adolescence ended. This will end also. There will be an ending point where we will kind of even out to whatever a new normal is for us. And to give yourself some compassion, that you're not broken. There is nothing wrong with you. That can go a long way, because when we are shaming ourselves, it's that internal war that never does anything to help us actually make steps forward. And sometimes just the simple act of self-compassion and not fighting against ourselves can start to quiet down some of these symptoms. Because we're not trying to suppress it all. And so I think that, yes, sometimes we need to reach out to a therapist for support, and sometimes we do need to be back in therapy doing trauma work. I do think that for some people that very much is the case, or we do need a new partner because the one we have sucks. Like, that is entirely possible. However, sometimes we just need to be really kind to ourselves. And we need some great hormone replacement therapy, and we need a community of great women around us who can also help us navigate and know what it's like to go through something like this, and know that there will be an ending point. I know easier said than done, but it's important to remember that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can often forget just the importance of our attitude towards ourselves, and the access to connection. So having like a group of women who can commiserate and also understand exactly your experience, that can be so helpful. And it doesn't even have to be you get together and you just talk about the menopause. It can just be being together, but knowing that the other people get it. That could count for so much, as can that compassionate attitude. But often we're with a lifetime of being critical towards ourselves, because that seems to have worked. So it can be quite hard to access that, particularly when you're now in a place of suffering. So if you can do it, if you can't, get some support.
Be helpful.
And so the next question is there a correlation between trauma and prolonged perimenopause symptoms that can worsen anxiety and depression?
I mean, yeah, we've kind of answered this a little bit already. I know that the research that's coming out now really is talking about the correlation between earlier onset perimenopause and stress, which we can put traumatic stress under that category. So we are seeing perimenopause come on earlier for individuals who have a history of traumatic stress, most specifically sexual abuse. There is research around that, but it is in the earlier stages of coming out. And so if we're talking about earlier onsets of perimenopause, yeah, you're going to have prolonged symptoms potentially as well. And then, of course, there is research also talking about individuals that have experienced trauma, do have an intensified or experience intensified symptoms of anxiety and depression in perimenopause as well. So the simple answer to that is yes, there is a correlation there for sure.
Yeah.
And I think standard treatment probably in the generations, a couple generations before so like my mother's generation and the generation below her was antidepressants for treating this. Whereas now we might look at hormone replacement therapy as something that might be another option, or maybe the first, taking a look at that first, and then looking at antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication as a supplement rather than the first thing. Because again, decrease in estrogen also impacts greatly your mood, which is anxiety, depression, all those fun things that we've been talking about.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And from
Mhm.
the kind of biology of things, again, so one of the ways that our body kind of processes stress is through something called the hypothalamic pituitary
Mhm.
adrenal axis, which is kind of a network between our brain, our adrenal glands, and like our nervous system essentially. And so when our brain perceives a stressor, it then activates our nervous system through this network. And so then we get cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline coursing through our body to allow us to activate, to fight off this stressor or to run away from it or to do whatever we need to do. And there's a crossover between this HPA axis, which is our stress response kind of communication network, and our HPG axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary, always can't pronounce this word, gonadotropin axis, which is the relationship between exactly those two areas, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and then the secretion of hormones like estrogen and progesterone. And so when one's disrupted, the other one's disrupted, or can be often. So that can cause this, exaggerated stress response, which might also account for some of the changes in like temperature, for example, the physical experiences, as well as our emotional changes, mood swings and things like that. But yes, I think probably Laura's answered everything else that I would add there. And then the very last question, which we've just about got time for, is, would you recommend any therapies like CBT or hypnosis rather than prescribed medication from a GP?
I mean, hormone replacement therapy is kind of the gold standard for perimenopause, but of course, that's a conversation that every person needs to have with their doctor, and every person is different. Now, there is also, I think there is a couple of studies that are coming out of the UK recently that looked at the impact of CBT for women in perimenopause, and saw that women were greatly impacted in a good way with the use of CBT. So I think that, yes, like if you want to use that or if that's helpful for you, absolutely. Rather than hormone replacement therapy, again, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. I'm going to be very hesitant to say, absolutely, you should do it, because every person's body chemistry is very different. What's going to work for you may or may not work for other people. We can't think hot flashes away. We can't, like there are certain things that no matter how like great of work we are doing in therapy our bodies just are going to be doing certain things, right? We can implement our coping skills, we can implement all the amazing like good ways of thinking, and our bodies are still going to do things because that's just the season of life that we're in. And so if that's the place that you're in and you need extra support, I would never discourage anybody from going to do that. I would say if you can use that toolkit approach and kind of tackle it multiple ways, and if CBT and or hypnosis, if that's something that you're interested in, if that's what you want to do, great. I think there's also some other really wonderful things focusing on things like nutrition, sleep, movement, like lifting weights, building muscle mass, some supplements, and then medicine. I think those are the things that could all be focused on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'm quite keen to make a distinction with the research with CBT for menopause, because there was so it's actually some colleagues of mine from King's College created the protocol, a wonderful professor called Myra Hunter, and she developed it because of her own menopause experience, and she was a long-time health psychologist and realized that some of the stuff that we use to improve physical health experiences for people outside of menopause, maybe there's a pathway for doing it inside of menopause. And so the protocol of CBT for menopause is different. It's distinct to CBT for anxiety disorders or depression, and it's a distinct protocol. So anybody that practices CBT for anxiety or depression probably won't have been trained in the CBT for menopause protocol, and the reason that's really important is because it formulates specifically for the experience of menopause. So it means that some of the cognitive and behavioral strategies are really tailored to the experience, for example, of hot flashes, and other physical experiences that come up in menopause. And as a result of that, the outcomes of therapy are to do with mood, anxiety, and depression, but they're not just to do with mood. They were also measuring to see if this was effective for reducing the physical symptoms of menopause as well. And there was some really significant efficacy for actually symptoms like hot flashes being reduced. And one of the reasons for this is because of the tailored protocol, we're working with essentially the body's physiological reaction to the physiological thing in the first place. So we're not saying hot flashes are because of thinking, they're because of biological things going on. But if we think about this vicious cycle, we have these automatic ways of responding to them. And when we do something slightly different, which is explored in the protocol, that starts to feed back to the central systems, the autonomic nervous system, the HPA axis, all of that kind of thing, which then can help the body re-regulate. So I just want to make that distinction because there was a real outcry in the UK about the recommendations in the NICE guidelines for CBT for menopause as another means of showing that, you know, women are being gaslit and their menopause symptoms are all in their head. And this is really not where the researchers are coming from or what the research is, but I completely understand that reception to it because we do have a lot of systemic problems where women's health is gaslit. So it's something, yeah, it is something distinct. But if you are interested in doing CBT for menopause, make sure that your practitioner's been trained specifically in the menopause protocol. But like Laura, I also want to hasten to add that I don't think it needs to be either or. Biopsychosocial is best, looking at what works for your body on a biological level. And maybe that's HRT, maybe that's, you know, supplements and exercise predominantly, but seeing what works best for you and knowing that there are options. You know, you can give something a try and then come back to it later. And I just saw Camille's question about IFS and somatic therapy, which is shown to be effective for trauma. So I love IFS. I'm a big fan of IFS. I think it's still actually in its like primacy of lots of research for it, which I'm surprised at. So we can't say conclusively from like a wealth of evidence because it's not really there outside of menopause, let alone in menopause. There's just a few papers, but it's what I think is wonderful about IFS, which is what kind of Laura's making the comment about compassion earlier. I think it's a really helpful way of people being able to access compassion for themselves in a way that can be traditionally quite hard to do. And the somatic therapy element of things, again, in menopause with hot flashes and all range of varying symptoms that can come in, sleep disturbances and palpitations and disruptive things that really make you feel like your body's ganging up on you. Somatic therapy can be a beautiful way of connecting with that, but we don't have lots of research at the moment, but I think it's a definite promising avenue to try.
Yeah, I would echo the same thing about IFS and somatic therapy. I use both of them and all the time. I'm a somatic based therapist, so I love them. However, I very much recognize that the research isn't there on a general level, but certainly not for menopause. So I could not say that, yes, this is absolutely the modality to use. That being said, the attunement to the body piece, I think, is what would be important for the menopause piece, being able to track different cues, physiological shifts. And that could definitely help, probably even in tandem with the menopause CBT protocols. I think that's probably some overlap there just based off of what you're describing. And the focus on the nervous system is also going to be the overlap there, I would think, as well. So yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, polyvagal. That's nervous system. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hope you enjoyed it. It was lovely to chat with you as well, Laura.
Yes, so good to meet you and talk with you. I'm excited to read more on the menopause protocols within CBT. That's really exciting.
Yeah. I'll well, I can send you some of the papers if you
That'd
like.
be awesome. Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody. Thank
Bye.
you.